Military Intelligence Service Language School, located at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, was established during World War II. The Chinese division, which included my grandfather, Staff Sergeant Bob Can Wong, came from boot camps and army regiments from all over the United States, where they were very much in the minority. Despite the discrimination and hardships these soldiers and their families had endured as immigrants to this country, they served with honor in a unique all-Chinese American troop to help with military surveillance and communication. The extreme circumstance that created this story is compelling and noteworthy. The past reflects the reality of the struggles and fears in our country's history, and yet also the fortitude and positive impact that can prevail when individuals overcome barriers and strive to achieve all that is possible. Many Chinese men entered the United States during the California Gold Rush in 1848 and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1863. They came to find new fortune in America, the gold mountain, and workers were needed. But the economy suffered after the Civil War ended in 1865. Racism and hatred prevailed. The Chinese were forced into enclaves of Chinatowns and could only find work at low wages. In 1871, the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles Chinatown resulted in a mob attack, torture, and the killing of over 20 of the Chinese residents. The fear of the times resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act signed by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882. It was one of the most significant restrictions on immigration in U.S. history, prohibiting all Chinese laborers and for the first time targeting a specific ethnic group. Men who were here alone would find it too difficult to bring their families in, and were often forced to decide whether to stay alone or go back to China. The Chinese community became isolated in place. From 1910 to 1940, those that did immigrate often entered the United States through the Angel Island Immigration Station, not far from Alcatraz Island, enduring weeks, months, and even years of internment and questioning.
My father, he had to go through Angel Island, and then when my mother came, she came right after the war, and she went through Angel Island. I myself, when I was sent back to China to study, that's just at the right before World War II, before Japan invaded China, I went through Angel Island. At that time, even though I was only 12 years old, I was curious why that I had to go through Angel Island, because I was born here. So that I knew that much about immigration. So anyway, they interviewed me and put me through the ropes, which left an indelible memory, because, I felt that was just totally unjust.
Father was a merchant here, import and export, and so he's, I guess, a non-citizen, but I was born here, so I became a citizen here. And but the strange thing is, our family is so traditional that when I went to Gene Parker first grade, I didn't even speak English, not a word of English, but we call it same. And when we were young, we would be expected to go to Chinese school, and that's where I learned my Chinese language.
As World War II in the Pacific escalated, China's First Lady, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, addressed the U.S. Congress, asking to repeal the Chinese exclusion laws, arguing it would help her country's war effort by improving relations, and demanded respect for all Chinese people. President Roosevelt agreed this would be important to Asia and a way to correct a historic mistake. It was repealed in 1943. Despite the over 60 years of purposeful exclusion, Chinese communities rallied and felt the war gave them an opportunity to be part of the patriotic movement and a chance to be accepted by Americans as friends in a time of need. They found new employment outside of Chinatown in the defense industry, shipyards, and the war effort.
No, I was born in Oakland. We live above the store. We stayed in Chinatown and went to grade school and high school. I graduated from high school in 1942, and I enrolled at University of California at the engineering school. And at that time, I enlisted in the Army Air Corps. And so I started at Berkeley in the summer, and by February of the following year, I was called up for active duty.
Over 13,000 Chinese were drafted or enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces, over 20% of all adult Chinese males. Those who were identified as having bilingual skills, like my grandfather, were assigned to Fort Snelling in 1944. Originally set up as a Japanese language training center to help military intelligence, the mission expanded as China and the United States became World War II allies. The Chinese-American Fort Snelling soldiers were to be trained in Mandarin to be sent back to the homeland of their ancestors to serve as interpreters for the U.S. Army. Many of them were only 18 years of age at the start of this journey. Some had never traveled far from their home cities in America.
Well, like any other teenagers, once you got to the right age, you got your draft number, and you were called in. In October, I was drafted and got my basic training in Camp Roberts, California. They sent me to Fort Snelling to learn Japanese, but when classes started, it wasn't Japanese. They taught us Mandarin instead. So they gave us a crash course in Mandarin because I obviously needed some Chinese-speaking and Mandarin translating. So that's how I happened to be at Fort Snelling.
Well, I was born here, and I feel that I'm American, But of course, we're proud to be Chinese. So, in fact, when I was drafted when I was just barely 18 from Galileo, I'd never been out of the country. So, to us, it's very scary to have to go to a foreign country. But in fact, we were very glad that we were able to do something for the country, and that we could use our skill and our language for China. So that we have this feeling of kind of uncertainty, but maybe we're going to do something. Yeah. So that's what our purpose was during that time.
I recall that they called me to headquarters and said, we're going to give you a test, a Chinese test. Translate this article into Chinese and translate this Chinese article into English. And I never heard any more from them at all. So I went on through the Army Artillery Battalion. We went to Fort Benning, and they were getting ready to go overseas, which they eventually joined Patton's Army, Third Army. And but before that happened, I got orders to come back to the Air Corps. And so they reassigned me to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where they test experimental airplanes. I got a telegram, don't go to Florida, report to Minneapolis, Fort Snelling. And that's where the only time I knew that test I took must have had something to do with it. They had me pegged. I arrived at Fort Snelling, I think it was like 15 degrees below zero. And in January.
Weekends, we always made sure that we passed the inspection, we helped each other. Weekend evenings, the ones who had 3-day passes would always come back with some boxes of chow fan, and everybody shared it in the snacks. At Fort Snelling, we had several forms of recreation. In the afternoon free time, gambling was our favorite. Sergeant Can was an avid mahjong player. Others of us played blackjack or bridge. Larry, Jew, and I were part of a bridge playing group. Anyway, and then in the evening after dinner, our other form of recreation was gathering in the social hall and sang.
In 1945, as this troop was preparing for their assignments in China, their division director, First Lieutenant Ernest K.H. Eng, wrote, "Many of us have come a long way and have seen action on many fronts. We have been assembled together to share the responsibility of bringing about a speedy victory in Asia. To most of us, it will be a return to familiar soil. To others, a fulfillment of an ideal. Our training has been strenuous in the past months. It is only the beginning, but if we constantly keep in the back of our minds our main objective, winning the war, and why the Army came into being today, everything else will fall into its place." In April of 1945, the first group of 8 selected for their command of the English language were sent as the research team.
At Fort Snelling, they received a call from personnel in China saying that they needed a certain number of people. So we were part of a small group that were chosen to go and gave us a priority to travel as fast as we can to get there. As fast as we could was by air going across North Africa.
Well, we knew we were going to China and we're flying east. And of course, we didn't know the exact route that we were going to take. We left Fort Snelling to fly to New York. And I remember it was April 14th, and the pilot announced that President Roosevelt passed away. And while we were stationed in New York, I remember that VE Day came, and we were in Times Square, and with all the excitement going on. And so the thought occurred, gee, you know, the war is over in Europe, the people are coming back home, and we're just starting to go over, you know, to fight another war. And so we left right after VE Day. And I didn't know that going to China was going to take almost a month, flying all the way.
They flew on military planes limited by fuel capacity and the instability of any quicker route over the Pacific. They traveled through Greenland, Gibraltar, Casablanca, Algeria, Tripoli, Cairo, Iraq, and India.
We stopped at Karachi in India, and that was an eye-opener how poor the people were. And then from Karachi we flew to the takeoff point for flying to Hump, which is Agra, which is where Taj Mahal is. And we didn't get to go out to the Taj Mahal. And we left Agra to fly to Hump at midnight to avoid the Japanese planes. And so we landed in Kunming in the morning, about 8 in the morning. And touching down in China, we finally made it after almost a month. And it was an adrenaline rush to know that I finally touched down on the very dirt of the ancestral country.
Subsequent groups left with First Lieutenant Ernest Eng on an equally challenging 28-day trip, sailing on the USS General Scott, a transport manned by the U.S. Coast Guard. which took them through the Atlantic Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, Suez Canal, Red Sea, Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Bay of Bengal to India. From there, they boarded aircraft and flew into China. They found chaos and confusion in a rapidly changing war-torn China. They were assigned to different regions in China. They sensed that something big was going to happen.
When we went there, China was totally unprepared. They had no, army school or college school. In fact, the general I worked with was a teacher. It's just something like the Civil War. They had no people who become generals and leaders were just from the. If you have money and buy a following, you were a general. So things were unprepared. In fact, when I was the way they recruit is that we were walking on country road and the soldier with me saw this man coming back home with a load back to his village, and he said, "Drop that load. You're coming with us." And then at night I had it. I said, "What's going on?" The recruits are trying to escape, so they made me a temporary warrant officer, and so of course the people we meet in the Chinese army were the generals, colonels, and everything. So, you can't be a sergeant and be over there because there's colonel pouring tea for you. So, and so the funny thing is, even though I learned Mandarin, the general in charge, I was assigned to the Cantonese army, the 46th, and the general in charge was General Lee, who was a school teacher. And so he come over and said, "Larry, you're pretty good. Come join me, I make you a captain." I said, "Sorry, General. I don't think it'll work that way." But since they have their interpreters too. Their interpreters are strong in Chinese, weak in English. We're strong in English, but not too good in Chinese. So together, we got the job done anyway. So what's happening in the field come to the Chinese headquarters, it's in Chinese. So they give it to us in Chinese, and it's our job, along with the interpreter, to get together and translate it from Chinese into English and send it back to American headquarters. And that's our duty.
And so when the 10 of us got to Kunming, we were all reassigned. And Larry Liu and I were assigned to headquarters. And where General Wiedemeyer was working with the nationalist government. And being with an engineering background, I was assigned to the chief engineer. And so with a short stay in Kunming, the headquarters moved to Chongqing. We know that something was brewing, something big was going to happen, and we need better coordination between the United States Army and the Chinese Army, and not knowing what to expect. Whether the invasion is going to come in either mainland China or mainland Japan. So Larry and I, we flew to Chongqing. And so my job with the chief engineer was to take the daily reconnaissance flight reports, and that describes what they found relative to what the conditions of the bridges are, the railroads, the rivers, and the terrain. We got there about in July, and before you know it, August 6th, I think it was, the Japanese surrender. And as soon as that happened, the next day, we packed up and we all flew, the headquarters group, all flew to Shanghai. And that's where we stayed for the rest of the war.
The Fort Snelling troop finished their tour of duty in Shanghai. Some of them found love and came back with brides. The friendships that were formed would last a lifetime. Some lost family members, and many sacrifices were made. Their perseverance as they returned to the United States and boldly established professional careers and families contributed to a culture change in a world that had been discriminatory and limiting.
And the nice memory that I had from that is that the artillery group was formed by regular army that was stationed in Panama. And they'd never seen a Chinese before. And so I was one of the first Chinese that they've ever seen. And when I left, one of my buddies wrote me a letter that says, Lieutenant Sen made this comment, if all Chinese were like George, I like the Chinese.
The GI Bill gave them an education. They achieved success in so many endeavors, becoming physicians, scientists, engineers, educators, and innovative leaders. Ernest Eng attained the rank of lieutenant colonel before retiring in 1963. During his distinguished military career, he served under several general officers, most notably General George C. Marshall, when he was the ranking U.S. military representative in the negotiations between the nationalist and communist Chinese after World War II. Colonel Eng was a guest at the White House and was honored in 1999 by President Bill Clinton. Larry Ju became a physician and served the San Francisco Chinatown community well into his 90s, receiving honors from the medical staff of the Chinese hospital for his years of distinguished service.
At that time, if you serve in the Army, you get the GI Bill. And I'm very grateful for that, because if it weren't for GI Bill, I never would attend college or go to medical school, because we didn't have much over here, and my father think that, there's a lot of, discrimination, you want to put it, and everything he worked for went back to China. And you know what happened, the communists took over and we got zero. So we have to start over again. So if it weren't for a GI Bill, I don't think I would be where I am.
Larry Liu completed his college education and taught elementary school for over a decade, as well as working in the central office for the San Francisco School District. In 1970, he was featured in an award-winning English language program on KPIX television.
At that time, there were no Chinese programs on the air at all. So part of the appeal of the program was many elderly women had never heard Chinese spoken on TV, and they watched it just to hear a Chinese voice. But our purpose was to get them to learn a few basic words, and then hopefully continue to get lessons and study. Got a lot of response, a lot of fan mail. That was 65 lessons, and KPIX put it on their non-commercial 6:30 in the morning.
George Wang obtained his master's degree and became a Rockwell engineer and manager for over 32 years. He was nominated for the Engineer of the Year award for his technical work as a turbo machinery expert. He was instrumental in defining a fully integrated propulsion system working with NASA. His projects formed the basis for many space transportation engine designs. This documentary was made in memory of my grandfather, whose story is like so many who immigrated to America. From a small village in southern China, he came to escape poverty and subsequently could not return when the Japanese invaded and the communists took over his homeland. He worked in restaurants in several states and settled in Fargo, North Dakota. As part of the Fort Snelling troop, he served in the U.S. Army with the Nanking Headquarters Command and received an honorable discharge at the end of the war in 1946. He too found love during his assignment in Shanghai and married my grandmother. Together, they returned to the United States to build their future and raise a family. It took a long time, but many Chinese American soldiers who had served honorably in the armed services were able to become naturalized citizens and my grandfather received a certificate of naturalization from the United States government finally in 1963. Coming to this country alone with no formal education, he was sweeping floors, washing dishes, and cooking chop suey as a teenager. After the war, he moved with his young family to San Francisco and worked for over 20 years on the night shift at Pan American World Airways, preparing meals for intercontinental travel. During his career, he learned culinary skills on an international level at such famous institutions as Maxime's of Paris and was promoted to the management level before he retired. We owe so much to the perseverance, unflappable confidence, and bravery that paved the way for us.
Actually, if you look at it, they're part of the effort of all the different groups in the army that did the best they can for the country. And so if you look back on before the war and after the war, all the groups, whether it's Chinese, Asia, or whatever it is, did their part to change the view of that group, whether it's Chinese, Asia, or whatever. Their perception in the American society have changed drastically from before and now afterwards. And now what was disparate and separate after the war has become integrated. And I think Snelling Group and all the people who served in the army during that time, Knight Snelling and all the other groups, has a bit to do with the change. I think they did maybe a paragraph or a sentence in the chapter that changes the Asian history in America. The one that sticks out in my mind the most is the Japanese, when they're in internment camp, join and fight. During the war, they said, "Go for broke," and that changed history. And the words are more low key, but I think everything that all these people did somehow changed the history of the way that Asians and Chinese are seen before and after the war. And I think that is the significance of the Snelling Group. I hope so, anyway.
This documentary, Crossing Oceans in Service to Country, is a tribute to his generation who started at Fort Snelling to help form a bridge between cultures and to model the way for achieving goals of service to make this a better country. Their hard work, ingenuity, and positive attitude allowed for movement out of the segregated Chinatowns and dramatically changed the opportunities and lives of future Chinese Americans. My brother, my sister, and I, and all the children and grandchildren of these brave men, have had such a different life experience with so many opportunities. My family remains committed to sharing the stories of those who immigrate to the United States under the most adverse of conditions and the contributions that have been made.
With still wet behind the ear, and so it was so glad to be back to the Bay Area. And the song that I remember best is San Francisco, open your golden gate, you let no strangers wait outside your door. San Francisco, here comes your lonely one, I'm coming home and won't go wandering no more.